Okay, so we've heard what the data says. So let's have a discussion about it now, and a stellar panel to do that and to take your questions too. So let me introduce, in no particular order, just put your hand up as I do it, Steve Armitage, the Children's Commissioner. Of course, Professor Brian Bummager, our keynote speaker today. Catherine Woods from Education Queensland and Sue McKee from Queensland Health. We've heard their data snapshot just before morning tea. Professor Matt Sanders, parenting expert and founder of the Triple P Positive Parenting Program. They're in the middle. Great to have you with us, Matt. Professor Ross Hommel, another favourite of mine, who is Foundation Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University and a Director of the Key Centre for Ethics, Law, Justice and Governance. Professor Karen Thorpe, welcome, from the School of Psychology and Counselling in the Faculty of Health at QUT. Can we have a round of applause for our panel? So I'm going to start by asking questions. We have about 50 minutes to do this, and I'm going to throw to you too. So if you've got a question, make sure you jot it down and we'll come to you soon. And I'm going to start with our professors here. We've heard about health, we've heard about education, but the world of childhood and young people is obviously much bigger than health and education. Matt Sanders, what haven't we talked about or heard that we should have?
I don't think we've talked about any population level indices of parenting or family relationships, which I think is crucial. The way I look at it, of all the possible things that we could do to improve kids' life opportunities, there's none more important than having kids being raised in a healthy, low conflict, positive family environment. Because it's the common pathway that can influence a diverse range of outcomes, from language development to kids' emotion regulation, their social skills, peer relationships, their readiness to transition into school, their academic achievement and beyond.
Have you got a piece of data or a statistic that you could give us that shows that?
Yes, there is. There's been a number of population surveys being conducted of the Queensland population that have helped to, these are random household surveys that have helped to define the prevalence rates of behavioural and emotional problems and the kinds of parenting practices that can be problematic within the community. I think one of the things that I just draw to everyone's attention, it is not socially normative to prepare for parenthood. And it is, less than 20% of the Queensland population participate in a parenting program that could promote better outcomes in children. But to change this situation, I think we need a much stronger consumer and end user focus, because we've got a generation of parents who've grown up in an age of technology. They don't want to do parenting programs in the ways that were done 20 and 30 years ago. The most preferred way of accessing parenting advice is through television. The next most preferred is the internet. The least preferred is home visiting. The second least preferred is going to a group parenting program. And the third least preferred is seeing a professional about a parenting problem. What do we offer to the Queensland community? The three least preferred ways of accessing parenting advice.
Very good answer. Yes, give him a round of applause. And Brian, I saw you furiously nodding as Professor Matt Sanders was saying that.
Right. I agree with everything Matt said. The other thing that I would add to that is, considering this developmental life course perspective that we're considering, there are key universal developmental milestones in childhood and adolescence that pose particular opportunities or risks. And you mentioned that it's not normative for parents to seek out preparatory training to become parents. That's the case for parents becoming brand new parents. It's even magnified when at the period of parenting early adolescence, in that really high-risk transition period from when kids are going from primary school into high school, and they become much more influenced by their peer group, and they begin to pull away from parents as a source of potential positive influence. So I would just reinforce the importance of thinking about those developmental milestones.
And that's also the age where they are really cyber literate, when a lot of their parents aren't too, I guess. Ross Hommel, what are you thinking now?
I'm thinking I've got so many ideas in my head I don't know where to start. I think what I might say is that we've had a year or two of absolutely toxic policy from our state government in my particular field, which is crime and justice. Although we've been focusing on outcomes for children and families this morning, we have talked about communities. We've actually got to think about policies and systems. Brian mentioned about punishing our way out of problems, the US philosophy. Well, we're no better here. And so only last week I was banging the table when we had a private hearing with a state government committee looking at what they should do about early intervention and prevention and crime policy. And I was quoting Bronfenbrenner, and I was showing them pictures of Brian's graphs showing population level improvements as a result of early intervention and properly managed, properly developed, properly resourced prevention initiatives, which are funded by the Pennsylvania State Commission on Crime and Justice. So my challenge, my personal challenge, is to shift the thinking of whatever government is in power in George Street to understand that investing in stronger families and communities is by far a more humane and more cost-effective approach to the problems of crime and justice in this state than the current crazy policies that are being promulgated.
I think I probably should go to... I think I probably should go to Steve Armitage there, the Children's Commissioner, who will take on a bigger role, I guess, after July, as you paint it to me. You've just heard a fairly damning indictment of the state government. Is your unit doing enough to educate parents, or perhaps to educate ministers and directors general about the importance of prevention?
Oh, thank you for that. I will not go into the area of that has been mapped out there. But what I will say, now, unfortunately I didn't get to see the first presentation, but I caught the end of your comments, or a response to a question about how can we be more persuasive about, based on what the evidence is telling us is effective with decision makers. And I think if anybody that's had the time to read the 2 volumes of the Carmody inquiry into child protection, will see in the first few pages a fiscal argument about not...
But we're not winning that argument, I think, which is...
Well, no,
the point.
no, I'm about to... I think has been significant movement, because I think what was persuasive was that if we continue to do what we are doing, what the data that Fiona showed before about the increasing numbers of children in out-of-home care, and particularly our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander fellow citizens, that it would cost the community in dollar terms, a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
So that caused an investment by the government, $406 million over the next 5 years, more directed into early intervention.
So when you see those statistics that Fiona went through this morning, or the others, do you feel that Queensland is middle of the road, that we're doing a good job, that we're right up there and just have to improve? Where do you put us as the Children's Commissioner?
I think that we, in the child protection area...
Children's wellbeing.
Children's wellbeing, I think there's some very promising data there. There were quite clear areas for improvement, but the mortality figures, the data that particularly heartwarming was the area of early childhood education and care, which I worked in myself for some time and had a role in. And in the area of mortality,
yeah.
Roland talked about 5-year snapshot. Health representative talked about 100 years and how much movement has taken place. So I think there's room for to celebrate. There is a lot more work to be done.
All right. Later today, Professor Karen Thorpe, I'll address this to you, we will hear that 25% of children go to school feeling anxious. That just tears me apart. What's behind that, and how do we address that?
Well, I think that's not my specific area. I do research in early childhood education and care, but I think one of the things that we discovered I did the evaluation of the prep year for the Queensland Government, and one of the things that we discovered was that children who'd already been in a group-based program went more securely into school, and they made more rapid progress in the first year. So I think there's nothing like being in a group and learning about being in a group and being confident in your community to go confidently to school. I don't know if that's specifically related to anxiety, but it is related to learning about the routines of school and the world outside your family. And that is done in kindergarten programs, but it's also done in a whole range of programs that are outside normal, the standard kindergarten program, like playgroups, for example. In the break, I was talking to the people I work with in Mount Isa, for example, where there's an Indigenous playgroup that's centred in a school in Mount Isa, many of the schools in primary schools in Mount Isa. Those children, over the time I've been evaluating them since 2008, go very confidently to school in a way they didn't at the beginning of that program. So I think those programs play a very big part. And feeling that you belong and you're part of that community, and that sort of picks up on some of the things Ross was saying, are very important.
Okay, on that, I'm going to throw to Catherine. And with this, the message we get through the media often, and probably from our politicians too, is that often it's best the child stay at home with mum or with dad before they go to school, that kindergarten or group care is a last resort. And yet we've just heard what Professor has said. We've seen some of that data. Just address that for us. Is that a communication issue, or is that...
I thought that we'd actually been quite clear that we want Queensland kids to go to kindergarten, very clear in fact. So there has been, I think, a strong shift over the last 5 years. So while the government prioritisation of early childhood education programs started in 2009, we had to build more services. So we couldn't go out and do really significant education and communication programs with families and have them running to kindies that didn't exist. Yeah. So we needed to build more services and create more opportunities and strengthen the early childhood workforce and make sure that there were qualified teachers and good early childhood education programs. So the Queensland Studies Authority, for example, established the Queensland Kindergarten Learning Guideline. So some of the good indicators around quality programs, around the workforce and the quality of the program and those kinds of things needed to be established, and they are now. So Kindy Counts is an amazingly strong and well recognised communication strategy in Queensland. And if families don't know, I encourage each of you to get out there and talk to them, because we certainly want kids in kindy programs, because it is a really good thing in terms of helping kids transition and prepare for school.
So given your data earlier, what is the one big thing we have to get over? Where could you see the biggest improvement in relation to your area?
I think it's about service integration. So we've got early childhood education programs across the state now. So if kids can't access a centre-based service, they can access eKindy, which is a distance education program. But I think it is about the quality of connections between early childhood providers, so connecting maternal and child health, parenting and family support, and early childhood education programs. So some of those integration services, I think, is the next. It's a big challenge for early childhood organisations and services, but there are a lot of really skilled and capable people in the sector, and many of them are in the room today. There are a lot of really skilled and capable organisations. We need to do a lot more, in my view, around collaboration
Professor
across
Karen Thorpe, you would agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess some of the things we've seen is something like the Communities for Children's programs, where we do see longer term funding, which is part of that, and funding that is going to pre-existing organisations, but to get them working together has been very, very successful.
To health, and can I ask you, Sue McKee, on your data, what's the big hurdle you would like to see us jump over?
I think it's similar to what other people have been saying. It's around that whole collaboration piece. Health can't cure the lifestyle of a child. It can create an environment where children become more healthy, and we have lots of research around how children to cure disease and those sorts of things. But without the education system and without the community and without the family itself, we don't have the magic bullet.
Steve Armitage, your unit will have an educative role. How will you use that to improve that collaborative approach that we've been hearing about? What can be done?
Using that educative role, we, among other tools that we've got, is encouraging, number one, a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And for me, at the end of the day, it's children that are more children living at home with their parents that are safe and nurtured and thriving. That's the outcome. And I think we all have got a role to play in that and achieving that. So we'll have responsibility for developing an outcomes framework for that can assist the whole reform. But we'll be running a social marketing approach to getting information out to that can give choices about different behaviour. And like it was the challenge that was mentioned before about before we really do start giving strong messages about picking up services earlier than later, we need to make sure those services are in place, and that 406 million I talked about earlier is a big component of that. We'll be building that capacity.
Both Karen and Catherine are nodding in response to that answer. Brian, you've done this so many times and advised on it so many times. We're not paying you a consultancy rate today, but what's the free advice that you would give Steve in terms of building that collaboration here in Queensland?
Well, I think that there has to be an intentional effort to integrate across government systems, and it has to be led from the very top. It has to be endorsed and promoted and supported.
At the very top, meaning
politics? In politics. In our case, because we're working at a state level, it's at the state level. It's a multi-agency steering committee that oversees the work that we do. It's a multi-agency steering committee that represents all of the cabinet level agencies in state government that have a role in impacting children and families. And so So once a quarter, every 3 months, the cabinet secretaries, deputy secretaries, bureau and division directors from those agencies come together and they talk about the specific goal of how to move science to practice in order to promote better outcomes for children and families. And when they zero in on that very narrowly and specific defined process, what happens is the things that they begin to talk about, the universality of the problems across systems becomes so apparent that the obvious thing to do then is to work collectively and collaboratively on interagency collaborative solutions that cross systems and begin to really break down the system silos. I think one of the I'm continually surprised at how little state level officials in my state are aware of the turmoil that's caused on the ground at the local level by the disconnect and these clearly separated silos of systems. They're just not aware of the turmoil and how much more difficult it makes all of this work. But once they become aware, they're very willing to think about creatively how to break down those silos.
And making them aware, is that usually a proactive way of doing that, or is it a reactive way in response to something happening?
Well, it's both of those things. I talked about the role of the intermediary organization, and I was explicit in describing our role as both a backbone organization and an intermediary, yes, intentional intermediary between service providers and NGOs and the government agencies that fund them and that also provide the policy parameters within which they must function. And so we started out by focusing our work on this capacity building for service providers and NGOs, and that led us to create these learning communities where we brought lots of service providers and NGOs together. And when we did that, what happened, what naturally was, again, some universal issues and challenges arose. And once we could synthesize those, then we could take them collectively to the policymakers and say, this is what we're hearing across all of the service providers and NGOs that you all fund separately. Now, and that allowed us to then facilitate a discussion together between the providers and the government officials.
Okay, over to you again, Matt Sanders. And I know your parenting program is in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. I want you to speak a little bit more broadly, in a sense, but from what you've seen in all those countries, is there one that stands out in relation to the well-being of children? And if they do, what are the ingredients there?
I mean, I guess the thing that I've learned about Triple P now being in 25 countries and 21 different languages is that the shared journey of parenthood is much more similar than it is different, and that we focus, and it's easy to focus upon differences between cultures while ignoring the common elements of raising children and the things that make a difference to their well-being. One way I've looked at it is if you look at a child throwing a temper tantrum in public, and you see that child in downtown Tehran, in Tokyo, in Brisbane, or in Penn State where you come from, it looks very similar. Not only that, it's universally embarrassing, and there's a huge motivational pressure to get your child out of the spotlight as quickly as possible, which narrows the range of options as a parent you've actually got. And parents everywhere can spot a good idea. And when you have strategies that have been shown to work, that have been properly tested and trialled, we talk about evidence-based practice in terms of policy and science. It's actually a consumer issue. There's data showing now that if you look at the factors that predict parents' willingness to participate in a parenting program, number one is that the program has been shown to be effective. It's actually a very important consumer issue. And I think at times that we see this realm of evidence-based practice and these the constant evolution of them through ongoing research and development is something that takes place somewhere else, but for it to be adopted and embraced and celebrated by the community, we must take the consumer as end user on this journey. Okay, so you've answered it wonderfully, but not exactly my question though. Like, in education we keep hearing about, Finland, for example. And I don't know if that's true or not, but in terms of what you see in the well-being of children, is there a country that has less problems or fewer problems? For example, in Sweden, home of children's rights, and it doesn't mean they have a community that is free from kids with serious behavioural problems. There's plenty of kids in Sweden who develop preventable behavioural and emotional problems. I mean, they've enacted laws that relate to the banning of corporal punishment that I'd like to actually see happen in Australia and in Queensland. Because coercive parenting is such a toxic contributor to family stress and the environment that children are being raised in. But the point that I'd make about the whole issue of no country that I've ever worked in has the answer that is immediately generalisable to completely different cultural contexts. All right, could I ask the same question of Professor Ross Hommel? And Matt Sanders talked about things that make a difference to children. In your studies and in your travel, can you just talk to us about anything that's on that international front that we should be paying attention to?
When we launched a report on the first 5 years of the Pathways to Prevention project at Parliament House in Canberra at the end of 2006, when John Howard was still Prime Minister and he was present at the event and spoke, I said to the audience that that the United States has the best research in the world, but the worst child policies in the world, and that we shouldn't go down that track. And he came up to me later and shook my hand and said that he absolutely agreed with me, and his whole goal with his family support packages and policies for children, like communities for children that Karen mentioned, was to provide that safety net in Australia and in fact to strengthen it. So I don't look to the United States for good policy, but I do look to the United States for absolutely fabulous, fantastic demonstration projects and innovation. And every time I come back from the US, I come back more and more impressed with that country and with their capacity to focus on problems, to collaborate, to set clear goals, to organise themselves to collect the data and to do all the things that Brian said. It's not just in Pennsylvania that it's happening. It's a culture of innovation, a culture of respecting and using science and evidence. Leave aside climate change, although even that is changing.
No, leave aside climate change.
So I do think we should continue to look at the US for inspiration, but in terms of our large-scale policies, in terms of child and youth well-being, we should be looking primarily to Europe, but also to our own history. Not to the UK. The UK is not a good model, in my view, but we should be looking to Europe, and we've been very innovative in this country. I want to rediscover our capacity for innovation. I do want to just mention that Brian's a partner investigator in a frighteningly large new project that we have here based in Brisbane, but it's going to operate in New South Wales and Queensland, where we're building the capacity for collective impact in communities for children, communities in both of those states. We're doing that in partnership with both the departments represented here, as well as the Departments of Education and Family and Community Services in New South Wales, and 5 non-government organisations, as well as the Federal Department of Social Services. So what we're doing is creating the capacity through the employment of collaboration managers who will work in communities, the capacity to actually collaborate to do all the things Brian's been talking about. We've been spending the last few days talking to Brian about the problems we're facing in designing this and implementing it. And we're absolutely committed to data sharing and to the establishment of clear goals and to the measurement of those goals through these community coalitions. So we're actually at the end of in 2 years' time, we'll be able to present, I think, the results of the first Australian scientific effort to build collective impact in disadvantaged communities with a focus on outcomes, particularly for vulnerable children. I'm extremely excited about this, and I think the fact that we have had all of these organisations, I have been going around the bushes beating up support for this, drumming up support, but these 2 departments here came to me and said, can we be part of this? Because I'd ignored Queensland. You know, I'd just assumed Queensland was a lost cause. And they came to me and said, no, Queensland's got to be in this. I mean, they didn't personally, but other people did.
Do you notice no one
So
else?
we have a lot of cause for optimism. I've got a lot of data like Matt does and Brian. We can show positive outcomes for children through family support, through parent education, through communities that care. There are many, many positive strategies. We're starting to understand this in this country. Sorry, I'll stop.
No, don't stop. You're here. Leave it on. We want to tap into your brain, but you've given us the big picture. And
Even if you have rooted for New South Wales.
I was born in Sydney.
But let's tap into your brain, and that's the big picture. And you're all saying more collaboration and more teamwork and more of all of that. And we've talked a little bit about how you go about that. But let's drill down a little bit. The importance of teamwork, let's say, even at school. I remember one children's court magistrate saying to me, Barbara Holdsworth, who you may know, and she said to me she had never, ever, ever had a child in her court, and I thought she was going to say whose parents were in the back of the court, and she didn't. She said who played every Saturday morning as part of a team, whether it's hockey or football or soccer. How important is that for our adolescents? It's not something we've heard mentioned.
Do you want me to answer that? Or,
yeah, give it a go.
I'll start and others can finish. Strengthening the links between families and their communities and schools, and obviously parental involvement in the development of children, is fundamental. Actually, parental involvement in their children's education is something we've looked at as part of our Pathways to Prevention project. I'm very concerned about it because it's a very poorly defined concept. Karen would know a lot about this. We only were able to, our PhD student was only able to show outcomes for the top half of the range of achievers within our disadvantaged schools. And I think this highlights something that a guy called Jack Shonkoff has been highlighting recently from Harvard about the biological underpinnings of a lot of the problems that vulnerable children are experiencing, and that we now need to innovate to build on the recent science, exciting science in the area of neurobiology and brain development and so on. Brian touched on this, to develop the next generation of community interventions to work address these very, very hard to shift problems. It underlies a lot of the stuff that Simon was presenting, Simon Rowland, with the NAPLAN scores. It underlies a lot of the risk factors, anyway, I'll stop.
Okay, who would like to take up then the next generation community interventions and the key ingredients for those? Karen, you've been a bit quiet.
Yes, we're taking on, because my area is developmental psychology, some of the measurement and some of the biogenetic differences. So that's part of the work we do. So we're interested in individual difference, how different children with different temperaments and underlying reactivity, so we measure that through temperament and through physiological measurements, react in different environments. Also, I mean, Jack Shonkoff, you've already mentioned, is directing some of the work into looking at children who not only live in disadvantage, but children who live in disadvantage, some have stability in their lives even if they live in poor economic circumstances, whereas other children live in very insecure environments. So, for example, they don't know if when they're going to get their next meal or what sort of meal that's going to be. So there's nutritional insecurity, food insecurity. Some children don't know where they're going to sleep the next night because of issues of safety. So levels of insecurity, and include into that what Matt has already raised, the stability of parent relationships, the number of people coming through. One of the things, I actually just recently came back from Washington DC where I attended a conference on how people like me, a researcher, get on with policymakers and NGOs, and it was a great conference, and these were some of the themes that came up. Where to next in research of the sort we do? So biological measurement of with children, because it's very easy to see our behavioural problem. A tantrum of a child in a supermarket is very evident. It's less easy to understand an anxious child or a child who's responding to those environments in family, in community, in an internalising way, so anxiety and so on. We saw suicide as one of the flag outcomes that Queensland needs to worry about. So we're actually, in the work we're doing in early childhood settings, using physiological measurements, so we do heart rate monitoring, we take samples so we can do some biogenetic work, to understand what is the individual reaction of that child in a setting? And we do a lot of observational work alongside the physiological measurement.
And can I ask you there, with Indigenous children and young people, is it the same approach that works, or do we need another plan there?
Well, the work I do is longitudinal, so we track them from young right the way through, so we continue to track children over time to see those pathways and to see not only continuities but important events and important things about the community that can disrupt a pathway downwards and change trajectories.
Okay, I can see both Matt and Karen wanting to say something. Matt?
I'd just like to raise the question of what is early in early intervention, and that when it comes down to thinking about what works and what can make a difference, I think there's a very strong push out there to think that all the action is over by age 3. And I think this is a huge mistake, because so long as kids are capable of learning and parents are capable of learning, they can learn throughout their lifetime. And we've got to think, when we think about a geographical catchment area of doing things in a community that promote children's well-being and development, we've got to remember that at every age group we've got new kids coming in and kids who are there leaving. And so the assumption that you can do all your early intervention work with the under 3s and ignore the potential for really successful intervention with older kids, primary school age kids and adolescents, I think is a mistake, because we've got also the one assumption has been parenting programs work much better with younger kids than with older kids. We've just completed a meta-analysis showing no difference in effect sizes from interventions on parenting with preschool age children and teenagers. We've actually got some of the weakest evidence with the parenting of very young children in terms of randomised trial results. But everyone talks about, the antenatal period and the immediate postnatal period. So I still don't think that we should put all our eggs in one basket in terms of phase of the life cycle.
And Catherine, you were wanting to say something?
Just in regard to who we look to for best practice, in my view, there are some pretty fantastic things happening here in Queensland that we need to highlight and talk about more. So while there is talk about America and Finland and Sweden and other countries, we've actually got some really exceptional practice right here in Queensland. And there have been evaluations, for example, of our early years centres, which other people have come and continue to come. So I know the Benevolent Society are well represented here today, and there's some people here from the Gowrie.
And C&K, I think,
Yeah, C&K don't run an early years centre,
No,
but those others certainly do. People come to those centres very, very often to look at what they're doing and to understand and unpack what the dimensions of practice are. You know, there are extraordinary things happening in those centres for families. So I think, and there's a range of things that are happening. So it's about what the dimensions are that we pay attention to. We pay attention to strategies for families and children. We pay attention to strategies for the early childhood workforce. And we pay attention to strategies for services. And you need to have all of those and strategies in place for each of those players. Because if you just pay attention to families and children, and not to the workforce, you need to look at all of the components to make it work, and that's certainly what our approach is.
We've been talking about the will of political decision makers too, and I want to go to your questions in just a moment, so get ready and we'll go to as many as we can. Well, is it twee to have a Minister for Children, or something like that on a state-based or a federal base could actually help push advocacy for children? And Sue, I'm going to go to you because you've been a bit quiet.
Very abnormal for me to be quiet. We have talked about that in the Health Department, whether there should be a Minister for Children, as there is some senior leadership in the mental health space. There's senior leadership and policy making in other dimensions of health, and whether children should actually have that senior leadership within the state or even within the country. We haven't got particularly far, but it is a conversation that has been occurring because there is a gap between what we're doing on the ground and what the policymakers are actually talking about.
And I guess you don't want it to become token, do you? If it's someone around the decision-making table, that's great, but if everyone puts it within their own portfolio, that may even be better. Has someone else got a strong view?
I'd just like to respond to that, or add to that. I think, as we know that the issues that children and families deal with are complex and do require a whole range of different perspectives and disciplines and programs to be involved. So the risk of having one portfolio that's responsible is that you work against that. The opportunity to work collaboratively. So I think you need to bring a multiplicity of lenses to these issues. And I'd like to take a leaf out of that advice that was given earlier and just mention that the reforms that we're about to embark on in Queensland, moving to action, actually are led at the highest level, at the Premier's level. Senior officials with Premiers run the a committee comprised of health, education, myself and others, to oversee and to work with regional committees and local approaches to delivering.
And do you believe
services.
your unit will be stronger or as strong as the current children's unit?
Well, my intention is to utilise the opportunity the opportunity is here now for research and evaluation to be listened to and embedded in the way we do things. And we've been given a 10-year time frame. We've been asked to provide advice in the first 5 years, particularly using data, evidence that value is being added with this investment, so on.
All right, so can I go to your questions? Who'd like to ask a question? And if there's any way we can just raise the light level a little bit, that would be great too, so that we can see hands. Who'd like to ask the first question if I say I've got a good bottle of red to give to the first person? Thank you, ma'am. Works every time. We'll just get a microphone up to you. And who's going to be second, if we can? Thank you. So, and if we just keep them up and we'll go through as many as we can. Could you say where you're from, direct your question to the relevant person, and if we can make our answers fairly short so we can get through a fair few. Thank you.
I noticed you were looking at me when you said that.
No, I wasn't.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. My name is Karen Menigos. I'm here with two hats. I'm a PhD student. I'm also working with Children's Health Queensland. My question is about this sense of collaboration and whole of government sort of working together. And we've heard earlier about the NEST targets and what I guess the non-government sector is advocating for, but from a government point of view, do we or would we, what would be our targets for children's health and wellbeing if we were working together?
Who is the question to?
Who wants to take it?
Karen,
I mean,
thank you.
I think we have to firstly look at the data we've been presented with this morning, and I'm sure everyone here would agree that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children seem to be a very real and a very important target to work with, and it may be that one of the things that we need to look at is whether the standard policies and practices need to be somewhat adapted, and certainly that's the experience I have in doing evaluations in that space. So that would be one, and in education I would name that we would need to look at, Brian talked about the importance of not only parents but of teachers, and I think that's a very real zone that we need to go into, particularly in early childhood education and care. 1 million children each day in Australia are in early childhood, in long day care, and those people are paid poorly. And we see a lot of talk about the cost of childcare, but not of the value and of the work that's done there.
All right, and Sue, thank you.
I guess I would, my temperance on this would be I would want the community and the people at large to set those goals and standards rather than government. Government tend to set nice averages that they can meet because it looks good in the paper. I think it's more about what is it that the community needs and what do they believe is the most important thing for the children that they care for.
Let's go to our next question, sir.
My name is Tim Eltham. I'm currently working with the Ipswich City Council. Brian, you have on your first slide a wonderful map of Pennsylvania in which you have all these different communities shown in green where there's been efficacious work undertaken. And that seems to suggest that something was happening in those communities at the community level and not just at the whole of state level. And that also suggests that they probably had some local level, community level data to work with. Could you tell us a little bit about the sort of data they were using at that community level and how it actually was critical for what they carried out?
Sure. Well, so you raise a couple of different important issues that relate to scale, because when we find out what works and we have something that we know might be effective and generate positive outcomes, the goal is then to get it out at a sufficient scale that we can move the needle at the population level. So there are two in every community in Pennsylvania, over 100 that adopted this approach that I described, this collective impact / data-driven decision-making / use of evidence-based strategies approach. They all joined in for one of two reasons. Either something bad happened in the community that stirred their desire to prevent their community from being the next place that something bad happened, or to prevent that thing from happening again, or they were responding to a government tender. And there are equal amounts of both of those, and we'll take advantage of whatever the incentive is. But once the initial interest is there for either of those two reasons, the first thing that we do is go into the community and train them and build the capacity for them to engage in this process of local data-driven decision-making and collective impact. So the first step is forming their coalition, getting them to identify all the people that should be involved and around the table. The second step then, after they form, is to get them to collectively go through a visioning process, because that's part of the actual real collaboration. They all have to believe that they're working towards something that they all agreed on and have in common. Then the next phase is this diagnostic problem identification phase, because Once they've identified the problems, the behavioral outcomes that they want to prevent or reduce, then we get them down to collecting data on these underlying risk and protective factors. So we do that primarily through a student self-report survey that's administered in the schools, and then we add to that a lot of local community focus groups, discussions to put the data into context and understand what it means to the community locally. And then we add to that a lot of administrative archival data that exists in systems.
Pretty
Does that
thorough
answer your
answer
question?
there. Answer it? Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir, for that question. And just behind you, ma'am.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, you've demonstrated from the data that the education is improving through the reading statistics, and also that the mortality and morbidity of our children is improving in Queensland. We also saw from Catherine that the number of notifications into the department has drastically risen, yet those investigated and substantiated has remained roughly the same. I just wonder then, what do you consider is driving the increased numbers of our children in out-of-home care, and why is that number rising? What politically is wrong in terms of the system that's increasing those numbers, that we're not seeing a similar trend in patterns?
I might just respond to that.
Can you just take a microphone, please?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Just on numbers in out-of-home care, and one of the things I didn't quite get to in my talk, as I alluded to, and you've mentioned, the number of notifications have been fairly stable and have in fact decreased over time. When we look at numbers of children in out-of-home care and analysis of, Claire Tilbury shows that it's actually the length of time children in care that has been increasing. So instead of maybe going into care for 12 months or less, they're actually staying in care for 2 years or slightly more before they return home or leave care. And it's actually, so the same number of children are going in one end, but there's a smaller number leaving at the other end. So that's what's happening in out-of-home care.
Okay, does that answer your question, or was it more than that? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you. It's Justin Canardi from University of Queensland. I've just got just 2 points. One comment I want to make about mortality statistics. I just wondered if somebody was keeping track of morbidity and disability rates, given that the mortality rates seem to be flattening out or perhaps dropping, whether there's a flow-on effect in terms of morbidity and disability. So that's one comment. The other comment I have is that I think that my particular interest is in mental health, particularly with the younger kids. I know that there's problems with dealing with mental health in adolescents, and there's been a lot of initiatives associated with that. But I think one of my concerns is that I believe there isn't a sufficient skill set to understand, and good systems to understand and cope with mental health problems right down to the preschool and underage group. I think this is an area where we need a lot more development, we need a lot more understanding, a lot more research happening in that area. And I'm not talking here about broad behavioural problems. I'm talking about the anxious, depressed, these kinds of problems that actually tend to generate long-term problematic outcomes.
Okay, just keep the microphone for one moment, sir. I think, is it Sue best on the morbidity question? And who would you like to direct that second question to, which is a bigger issue?
Sue?
Yeah. All right, Sue, and then you can pass it maybe to Ross too.
Thanks, Justin. I'm revoking your fellowship. I'm kidding.
It's too late, it's on film.
In relation to the statistics collecting, I think the point's been made earlier. We collect data on just about everything in this state. So yes, those statistics are being collected. Is somebody specifically looking at it at this precise moment of time? I would suggest there is probably someone, potentially somebody in the audience that is. It's not something that I can pull off the top of my head, however.
All right, can I just say, is anyone doing that in the audience that could provide that information?
Could I say, we have a representative sample of children in early childhood education and care in Queensland in 2010. So that's a random sample of early childhood education and care centres in Queensland, in Greater Brisbane and Mount Isa, and that's we also have a comparative sample. So half the sample is in Queensland, the other in Victoria, as part of the For Kids study, Effective Early Educational Experiences for Children, in which screening measures of mental health would be in there, both of the parents and of the children. So those data are available. We're not using them in that specific way, but we certainly have them, and we can also look at the impact not only of the experiences in their early childhood education and care centre and their family, but we've tracked them longitudinally. The children have just done that plan, so that's our final outcome. But we would be able to look at that and look at how that relates to their ongoing outcomes. But we haven't looked. The data's available. It's not been collected in that way, but for that purpose, but it's there.
If I could just follow on from that point, I think I don't know whether it's worth mentioning. I know if this discussion was happening in the United States, it would definitely be worth pointing out that the difference between a conversation about mental health versus a conversation about mental illness or mental dysfunction. I was really impressed, I think it was Sue, in your slide when you gave that, the definition of health, that it was literally a definition of mental health. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot to be gained in this kind of community collective impact effort by trying to move the mean, by the old adage that a rising tide raises all ships. Yeah. So not only just trying to fix the tail of folks who are already having some kind of issue, but really, I'm convinced that some of the easiest things that we can do, the easiest and least expensive things that we can do to promote a whole host of better outcomes in children and adolescents and even into adulthood are increasing parent-child bonding and promoting emotional self-regulation. And we know that we can do those things, right? We know that they're very inexpensive. We just haven't prioritized those two things: parent-child bonding and emotional self-regulation. We know we can teach kindergarten children really good social, emotional self-regulation skills that promote better emotional health, behavioral health later on.
Okay, that comes back to the quality of the early childhood teachers as well as
All
parents.
right, can I go to Matt Sanders here before our next question?
Yeah, I think it's much more than child bonding, parent-child bonding. I mean, that focuses on the attachment relationship. There are many things that are happening in families that parents require competencies around in terms of promotion of language, promotion of social skills. That issue of emotion regulation, there's no better way of promoting emotion regulation in children than to have a stable, loving, low conflict environment with parents with the knowledge, skills and capabilities to teach kids the competencies they require to do well. And these are both social and emotional competencies. There's a study just about to be released from Central Ireland that has been a population study looking at the multi-level Triple P system in counties where it was a mixture of media and communication strategy, light touch parenting interventions, all group-based, up to a kind of a level 4 intervention. In control communities, it was services as usual. After 2.5 years, there's been a 35% reduction in the level of psychosocial difficulties in the intervention communities, and about a 40% reduction in parental distress. And this is primarily through a vehicle of promoting self-regulatory capability in parents and teaching parents the kind of skills and competencies they need to support their children's development. That is one of the most simple, lowest cost interventions with the highest yield that we can offer to a community, because it's population based. Yeah. And the data are speaking for themselves.
Thank you, Matt. Question there, thank you, and then over here.
Hi, my name is Tanya and I work across the state in early childhood services. My question is probably for Sue. Through my own experiences and also research I've read recently, the number of children, young children being medicated is on the rise for behavioural concerns. I just wanted your thoughts about that.
I think it comes back to the fact that I think this is the sleeper issue for the next generation. There is a large number of children with real mental health disorders, not just feeling a little bit anxious on their first day of school. And I think it comes back to that whole point about building capacity, not just within the healthcare sector to understand how to treat these children, but within the education sector to get the teachers to better be able to cope with this, to educate and give the family capacity, as we've talked about, so that they can actually manage these processes. I think one of the big kickers for me is that we are blaming technology a lot for the way that children are behaving and the way the world is. I think as a society we need to start embracing that technology because, as we've heard, we're having programs for people who sit in a classroom that don't want to be there, and yet television is the number one thing that they do. So let's start embracing technology and actually getting some of this capacity building in the way that people want to see it.
But just to extend your answer there, this medication of young children for mental health disorders, is that on the rise? Are the mental health disorders on the rise, or is the medication?
I would be speaking out of school if I actually gave you the answer to that. I don't know off the top of my head whether it's we're diagnosing more or we're medicating more or both. I don't know, and I'm not sure if there's any of our mental health team in the room.
Because that is scary, isn't it? That's, because the problem
statistic.
is just going to grow as they get older.
But it's also often about the parents' capacity to manage a child.
Which is Matt's
parenting,
point.
Yes,
Yeah,
the positive
okay.
parenting program. So, well, is it actually the child or is it the fact that the parents can't cope with the child?
Yeah. Karen, did you want to say something before I go to the next question?
Again, I don't know any specific data on which we can
base that. All right, sir. Thank you.
Hi, Brett Lush is my name from the Benevolent Society. Probably a question for Brian. Brian, one of your quotes in your presentation was from Patrick McCarthy, which said a bad system will trump a good program every time. I've also heard it said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. My thought is when we're talking collaboration, we're actually talking about a different culture, a different way of operating, recognising that the systems that we operate, especially across government, non-government, are so complex, have so many different layers. How do we go about deconstructing bad systems and building better ones that incorporate a culture of collaboration and partnership rather than silo service delivery?
Great question.
Well, and it's there's no elevator speech answer that I can give to that. It's a complicated question. I think an important aspect of that, I'll go back to the Venn diagram that I showed with the 3 overlapping circles. I think that we can't underestimate the importance of relationships and relationships that honor the person across the table, and so this is it. Changing the culture is about understanding the person that you're trying to collaborate. So if you're trying to collaborate with a government official, you have to be honest and recognize and honor the fact that they've got people that they need to answer to, and they have their own performance measures that they're responsible for. It kind of goes back to the question that you asked a while ago about where should we start? What should be our priorities? The first place my mind went to answer that question, it might seem a little unchild saver like, but the first place my mind went was to do a fund mapping exercise and find out where the most money is being spent, and start there, because the politicians need quick wins, right? So there are lots of other things that we've been talking about that we might be most interested in jumping to. But in my experience in Pennsylvania, for instance, I'm all about prevention and early intervention and primary prevention, but the first place I had to go was reducing out-of-home placements in secure youth correctional facilities. Yeah. Because that was what the state crime commission that was funding me, that's the thing they're most answerable to.
So you've got to play the political game, don't you?
Right. That wasn't that was okay. That would have been on my list too. It just would have been further down the list. But the fact that it was a quick win, and that it was a quick win financially, fiscally. So by reducing the number of kids that were going into expensive out-of-home correctional placement, we could immediately recapture some funds, and then we could start a conversation about, hey, let's invest in early childhood. Because when you go to a policymaker and say, hey, let's invest in early childhood and primary prevention, the first thing they'll say is, well, that's a really good idea. Where do I get that money to invest?
Yeah. Okay, Catherine, you wanted to add something quickly?
Just quickly, in terms of the system, and many of you would be familiar with it. I think it was launched a week or two ago at the QCOS conference. So in terms of system reform for government, the Social Services Investment Framework has recently been launched by the Treasurer, and through that process and the social services reform, which has, I would say, certainly pushed agencies together a lot more than it ever has before in terms of collaborating. So there is a lot more transparency about where government funding is going, and it's available on a public portal now around where early childhood money goes. The intention is to get it mapped across Queensland and to have that available. So more transparency and accountability about the investment, the government's investment in social services, which includes services obviously for children and families.
People in this room.
And people who receive it in this room.
Yeah, okay. Our next question is here. Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
This is a very pragmatic question, and I hope it doesn't change the tone of the discussion too much. But in terms of investing in early childhood and families, I personally have been listening to that conversation for over 30 years, and I think a lot of progress has been made, and it's fantastic. But the reality is that the professionals that work in the early childhood sector and the practitioners in human services are the lowest paid professionals in this country. And what does that say at the end of the day about the value of the work that they do and the efforts that they've put in as individuals to get the knowledge, experience and qualifications they have, and the efforts that they make? Because it's not good enough anymore at the end of the day to say, well, think about the great work you're doing, when they talk about wages and conditions.
There's so many people nodding in the room. Steve Armitage, how will you use your unit to improve the wages of people in that industry? Am I being unfair? Who would like to take... I mean, it is a big issue though, isn't it? You know, and you just take it to the babysitting level. People, you know, arc up about paying $15 for a babysitter, but they're happy to go and open a great bottle of red over dinner. You know, these are you're people who are dealing with young lives, the lives of our children, disadvantaged, you know, children and youth, and the pay is pittance. How do you win that argument?
I think the argument is our role is to provide information and advice and evidence. There are political decisions that be made at the political level with the community, the voter. Yeah. And that's the reality. Yeah. And I think that we, in the area I've got responsibility for building workforce capability in the human services area, responsible for impact on child protection. That will be one of our priorities in the next 12 months, to look at how we can improve capability, a range of areas.
Does that include pay?
Well, as I say, we can bring, we haven't decided on what it will include because we'll be consulting about it.
Okay, Karen?
I would say providing evidence, and we will hear in the next week whether we have been successful in a grant that has been supported by the Department of Education, Queensland Office for Early Childhood, with partners Good Start Early Learning and C&K, to look not at human services but to look at the early childhood workforce. Across the country, of course, early childhood educators are being asked to improve quality, to get more qualifications, to be more accountable for what happens to children during the day, so their work days are long, they get very few breaks. And in addition to that, the request is that they do that without any request for more pay. And that is a major issue, given that we've heard that teachers have mental health issues, and we know that parents who are living under stress, and it is a stressful job. In the last 5 years we've spent in the project I'm currently working on many hours observing that work. And it's skilled and stressful work. It's not dealing with one child having a tantrum, it can be many at a
Yeah.
time.
All right, but that's largely
so
you're
the question
agreeing
is,
with...
let's get some data, and I think there's very good will. Certainly it's recognised by Queensland Government, and the providers are very concerned to make sure that evidence is there. I think we need evidence first to then look at direction.
Okay, well, our time is up, but I just want to end this panel by going straight down from Catherine down to Brian. And I just want one message, very brief. It can be 10 seconds, it can be 20 seconds. Go over and I'll turn your mic off. No, I'm just joking. But yeah, what is the message when we walk out of here? What is the one thing that you would like us to have a think about, or to consider, to talk to someone, to go back to our organisation and do?
I think we all need to keep talking across disciplines, so take a more multidisciplinary approach in terms of early childhood development. Talk to people outside education, talk to people outside health, talk to people outside parenting, talk to people outside family support. If you're a social worker, go and talk to an early childhood educator. If you're a early childhood educator, spend some time with a maternal and child health nurse. So broaden your skills and work with others.
Thank you, Catherine. Sue?
Build a garden.
Sorry?
Build a garden. Everybody should have one.
Oh, I like that. Ross?
I had something in my head, and I think that's such
Yeah,
a good idea.
That's right. Everyone's now rewriting this.
Look, I think I want to affirm what I think most of you are doing in the human services, early childhood education sectors. I've got data now out of our Pathways to Prevention project that shows that routine family support, which is not necessarily evidence-based, not necessarily administered via a manual, and it perhaps should have been, but it wasn't, can nevertheless have very positive outcomes for both children and parents. Now, that is not universally the case. There are aspects of current practice that weren't effective. I want to encourage practitioners, all the practitioners and policy people here, to take seriously long-term evaluation of what you do, because there's great power in what you do, but it's not all good, or it's not all cost-effective. So we need to winnow the wheat from the chaff, and we need a program of, we need to change our culture, and I know we need to improve the pay, and we need to engage in a long-term process in this state and elsewhere in Australia to understand the power and the effectiveness and the problems in what you are currently doing.
Thanks, Ross. Karen?
Mine would be about communication, and I'd take up the points from Brian's Venn diagram and the words that came up afterwards, and it was the message at the conference I was at recently as well, that we all have different perspectives. And I think what I'd say to people in the audience is tell other people about what you do, and Brian's message was we need to listen. And I guess my own personal thing that I've taken from that meeting recently in the US and this meeting today is I need to rethink the time I use. I spend a lot of time doing the evaluation, but in the listening and the observing, because it has to inform the work we do.
Okay, and communication certainly we'll talk about in one of our panels this afternoon with senior journalist Kylie Lang. Professor Matt Sanders.
I think with evidence-based practice we need to move, and I think the field has moved well beyond the train and hope model of just simply training a workforce to employ an evidence-based practice. Most of the action to do with impacts on children and communities have to do with the implementation process around the deployment of these interventions, and so issues to do with workforce development, supervision, having systems that are accountable and having measurement of outcomes that promote reflective practice amongst all the players, I think is very important.
Thank you. Steve Armitage.
I'd like to say two things. I think we should, whatever we do, and it should be driven by evidence, we should have the citizen at the centre of what we do, and are we making a difference? And the other thing I'd like to say is that we need to give, the evidence overwhelmingly tells me we need to give priority to a better response, a better engagement with the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Yes, thank you, Steve. And to Brian, last word?
Last word. Good on you, Queensland. I've been here since last Friday. This is my second or third time in Brisbane, and I've met so many really passionate, committed, really smart people who are doing this work. And so, you know, it's easy to sit up here and talk about all the problems, but you're really doing fantastic work, and I applaud you.
That's a wonderful way to end, and I was at a lunch with Brian on Tuesday, and the questions then too, entirely different from the questions today, but just as engaging and people desperate to make the life of the people they work with better. Thank you. Please put your hands together for our wonderful panel.